Today, we're diving deep into a shocking and tragic story that shook the foundations of a prison system. It all started when an inmate uncovered an affair between his wife and a prison guard. A discovery that would unravel lives, leading to the loss of 2 innocent lives and turning the prison into a stage for betrayal and murder. The consequences of that moment would change everything, and as we go through this journey, we'll see how betrayal and revenge can drive people to do things beyond comprehension. Stay with us as we unravel this devastating chain of events. Betrayal is something we all experience at some point in our lives. It's that gut-wrenching feeling when someone you trust deeply lets you down. And then, there's revenge, a deep urge to balance the scales when you feel wronged. But what happens when these emotions spiral into something far darker, leading to irreversible consequences? When we take matters into our own hands, where does it stop? Can we ever truly escape the cycle of vengeance once it begins? This isn't just a story about an affair or a crime. It's about the human capacity for both love and violence, and the price we pay for letting our emotions take control. In this case, the boundaries between right and wrong blurred in a way that led to deadly consequences. In a prison where control is paramount, one discovery of dishonor set off a tragic series of events, one that could have been prevented. The real question remains, could this spiral of violence have been avoided? What started as a confrontation between an enraged inmate and a betraying prison guard quickly escalated into a bloody sequence of events. But was it really the guard's fault? Was it simply a case of revenge gone wrong, or was there something deeper at play here? The system, the emotions, the broken trust, all of these contributed to the deadly ending. The real question is whether anyone in the system, anyone in power, could have done something to prevent the ultimate betrayal that led to these deaths. As we unravel this story, the line between justice and vengeance begins to blur, and what seemed like a simple confrontation turned into a tragedy that could have been avoided. Stay tuned as we uncover the truth behind this bloody double homicide. Joseph Lee, a man whose life had been shaped by the harsh realities of prison, had spent the last 8 years behind bars. A sentence for armed robbery that had initially seemed like a short blip in his life, had turned into something far more permanent. His days were filled with routine, the endless hours of solitary confinement, the cold, indifferent guards, and the camaraderie with other inmates who shared his fate. But Joseph's world, one that had been dominated by his own survival, was about to be shattered by an unexpected revelation. It was during his time in a high-security prison in Southern California that Joseph first noticed Officer Mark Harris. A prison guard whose sharp, calculating demeanor and air of authority commanded respect among both inmates and staff. Harris was everything Joseph wasn't, free, untouchable, and on the other side of the prison walls. But what Joseph didn't know was that Harris was also everything Joseph's wife, Emily, had secretly craved for months. The rumors began to spread quietly among the other inmates, whispers about the guard's special attention toward Emily, a woman who had been visiting Joseph regularly for years. At first, Joseph dismissed these rumors. He had enough on his plate to worry about, surviving the daily grind of prison life and trying to keep his family intact on the outside. But something inside Joseph started to stir when he heard those rumors more than once. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. And so, he began to pay closer attention to the seemingly innocent exchanges between his wife and Officer Harris during her weekly visits. It all started innocently enough. Officer Harris had always been professional, or so it seemed. He'd often greet Emily with a brief, polite handshake, followed by a simple, "How's he doing?" But over time, the interactions began to shift. The conversations lengthened, their smiles became lingered, and Harris's attention toward Emily grew more than just routine. The tension between the two was palpable, but it wasn't until Joseph's discovery that the full scope of the affair came into focus. One afternoon, Joseph had been allowed a rare visit to the prison's outdoor yard, a break from his otherwise monotonous existence. He had been walking along the perimeter, the dull roar of the prison echoing in his ears, when he spotted them. Through a crack in the guard's office windows, he could see Emily and Officer Harris, not just talking, but laughing, leaning in close, their bodies almost touching. It was a look he knew all too well, one that spoke volumes about a relationship far deeper than the simple exchange of pleasantries. Joseph stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the sight of his wife with another man, but the realization that this betrayal had been happening under his nose for months, perhaps longer. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of which he could grasp. In that moment, time seemed to stretch, and Joseph understood something in his gut. The man he had trusted to oversee his safety, a figure of authority, had broken the most sacred trust of all. Joseph's world erupted in a storm of emotions. Anger. Rage. Humiliation. The sense of helplessness he had lived with for so long suddenly intensified. Here he was, confined to a prison cell, shackled by his past and the choices he had made, yet the greatest betrayal of his life had come from outside the bars. From the woman he had married and the man who had sworn an oath to protect those within the walls. What made it even worse was that Joseph couldn't do anything about it. He had no control. He couldn't confront Officer Harris. He couldn't demand an explanation from Emily. All he had were the suffocating walls of his cell and the unsettling whispers from fellow inmates. His thoughts turned dark, thoughts of revenge, of confronting the two of them, of forcing the truth into the open. But Joseph knew that revenge wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just about confronting his wife and her lover, it was about the dangerous consequences that awaited him if he acted on his feelings. Prison was a place where anything could happen, and any action, especially one motivated by anger, could have deadly consequences. As Joseph grappled with his emotions, he found himself unable to sleep, unable to eat, the weight of the betrayal consuming him day by day. The rage he felt for Harris was one thing, but the humiliation he felt toward Emily, the woman he had trusted with his heart and his family, was something he couldn't shake. He had been living a life of quiet survival in the prison, doing his best to remain out of trouble. But now, with this new knowledge, the game had changed. Joseph Lee, the inmate with a past he couldn't escape, had a new battle to fight, one that would put everything on the line. The slow burn of anger turned into something far more dangerous. The longer Joseph stayed in that small cell, the more his mind focused on one thing: revenge. He couldn't let it go. There had to be a way to make them pay, to restore the honor that had been stolen from him. The only question that remained was how far he was willing to go to make them suffer for what they had done. And when the moment came, would anyone be able to stop the violence that was about to unfold? Every day, Joseph's rage continued to simmer, festering in the dark corners of his mind. He couldn't shake the images of his wife and Officer Harris, their intimacy playing over and over in his mind like a twisted movie reel. Prison became his battleground, not just for survival, but for justice, or perhaps, vengeance. His cell, once a place of solitude, now felt like a prison of its own making. The thick walls around him seemed to close in tighter as the days passed, the hours dragging on endlessly. He had no peace, no escape from the thoughts that gnawed at him. Every conversation he overheard between other inmates, every fleeting moment of silence, was filled with his thoughts of what had been taken from him, his dignity, his marriage, his trust. Joseph knew he had to act, but the question was how. How could he confront Officer Harris without attracting the attention of the guards? How could he make them both pay without sealing his own fate? He spent nights plotting, rehearsing his every move. His plan became an obsession, and every detail had to be perfect. It wasn't enough to confront Harris. Joseph needed to make a statement, one that would reverberate through the walls of the prison and the world outside. He began to watch Harris more closely, learning his patterns, his routines, and waiting for the perfect moment. The tension in Joseph's mind reached its peak, and he knew that soon, he would either be consumed by the anger that filled him or take control of his life once again. That day was coming. The moment came faster than Joseph anticipated. He'd learned enough, and he had planned for this encounter meticulously. Harris was alone in the staff lounge late one evening, taking a break from his usual rounds. The opportunity was too perfect to ignore. Joseph knew this was his only chance to make things right, or as close to right as he could make them. He slipped out of his cell under the cover of darkness, moving silently through the prison halls. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the cold certainty of what he was about to do. Each step brought him closer to Officer Harris. His hands clenched into fists, his pulse pounding in his ears. Every moment, every breath, was a reminder of the anger that had been building up inside him for months. This wasn't about just an affair anymore. This was about reclaiming his pride. When Joseph entered the lounge, Officer Harris was sitting with his back turned, unaware of the storm about to hit. Joseph didn't waste time with words. He grabbed Harris by the collar, slamming him against the wall with a force that sent shockwaves through both men. The confrontation erupted instantly into violence. Harris tried to fight back, but Joseph was faster, more desperate. In a flash, Joseph drew a sharpened makeshift weapon from his waistband, a shiv fashioned from scrap metal, and plunged it into Harris's side. Blood splattered, painting the walls red. Harris staggered back, gasping in pain, his hands clutching at the wound. But Joseph wasn't done. The flood of anger that had built up over months surged through him like a raging river. He drove the weapon in deeper, his emotions boiling over, spilling out into the chaos that consumed the room. This wasn't just about punishing Harris, it was about destroying the man who had broken his trust. The struggle was brutal, a violent mess of flailing limbs and crashing bodies. In the midst of the chaos, Emily, the woman who had once promised to stand by him, entered the room. Her scream echoed through the walls as she took in the horrific scene. But it was too late to save Harris. Joseph, bloodied and covered in his own rage, turned toward her. The betrayal he felt for her, the woman he had trusted and loved, now consumed him entirely. With the bloodshed still fresh in the air, the guards rushed in, hearing the commotion from down the hall. But the damage had already been done. Harris was dead, and Emily, too, fell victim to the tragic aftermath. Joseph had done what he came for, but it had come at a price far steeper than he had ever anticipated. As news of the killing spread through the prison, the staff scrambled to contain the fallout. The warden and other authorities were left reeling from the brutality of the act and the way it had unfolded. A prison guard had been killed by an inmate, an act that had far-reaching implications. The entire system was shaken to its core, and the repercussions were felt beyond the prison walls. In the immediate aftermath, the prison went into lockdown. Security measures were tightened, and the investigation into the double homicide began. But for Joseph, the fight was over. His actions had sealed his fate. He was now facing charges far more serious than the original crime that had landed him in prison. The cold, calculated revenge he sought had cost him any remaining hope for freedom. Outside the prison, Emily's family was left to pick up the pieces of a life lost too soon. The affair, the lies, the violence, it had all come to this. Emily's family mourned the loss of their daughter, their sister, while Joseph's family struggled with the unimaginable. The man they once knew had become a killer, forever marked by the decisions he had made in the heat of rage. Joseph's world had been shattered not by the prison bars, but by his own anger and the betrayal of those closest to him. He had taken control of his fate, but at a cost he couldn't undo. As the investigation continued, the true extent of the tragedy began to unfold: a broken man, 2 lost lives, and a system that had failed to protect them all. The ripple effects of that violent night would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The question remained, was it worth it? Was vengeance truly the answer? And now, in the cold aftermath, there would be no turning back. As the bloodied aftermath of the double homicide spread like wildfire through the prison system, authorities scrambled to make sense of the chaos. The prison went into full lockdown, and the warden immediately called for a thorough investigation. Within hours, detectives from the local police department arrived, working alongside prison investigators to gather evidence and piece together the events leading up to the killings. The first priority was to secure the crime scene. Officer Harris and Emily Banfield were both found dead in the staff lounge, and the gruesome nature of their deaths left little to the imagination. The prison security footage was crucial. it captured Joseph Lee entering the lounge, his movements deliberate, his actions swift. The footage showed him confronting Harris and attacking him violently, but it stopped there. It didn't show the exact moment of Emily's death, nor the chaotic scene that followed. Detectives interviewed the prison guards who had rushed into the room moments after the commotion began. One guard, who had been stationed nearby, reported hearing a loud altercation but didn't see the initial confrontation. Another reported seeing Joseph standing over the bodies, blood covering his hands. There were no other witnesses in the room, which meant the detectives had to rely on Joseph's testimony to fill in the blanks. Joseph's response was calm, almost detached. He claimed he had confronted Officer Harris out of anger for the affair, but he denied killing Emily. He explained that he hadn't meant to kill her, but she had been caught in the crossfire when she entered the room. The officers struggled with his confession. Joseph had a long history of violence, but his claim of a heat of the moment killing wasn't enough to fully explain the bloody scene that had unfolded. As detectives delved deeper into the evidence, they found troubling inconsistencies. There was no sign of forced entry into the staff lounge, and nothing was stolen from the victims. A bloody knife was found at the scene, and Joseph had been found holding a makeshift shiv, the same weapon that had been used to kill Harris. However, Emily's cause of death was more complicated. She had been shot twice, and the bullets appeared to come from a different gun than the one Joseph had been carrying. The detectives were left wondering, had Joseph acted alone, or had someone else been involved? The lack of clear answers left the investigation in a delicate balance. The only thing they knew for sure was that this wasn't a simple case of a prisoner killing a guard in a fit of rage. There was something more beneath the surface. As the investigation progressed, the detectives began to uncover unsettling truths that no one had anticipated. The focus initially remained on Joseph, but as they dug deeper into Officer Harris's life, they began to unearth a web of corruption and deception that extended far beyond his affair with Emily. It turned out that Harris wasn't just a guard in a passionate but dangerous relationship. He had been exploiting his position of power for months, using his authority to manipulate and intimidate both inmates and staff. Multiple sources, including other inmates, came forward to reveal that Harris had been involved in illicit activities inside the prison. He had been accepting bribes from inmates in exchange for special privileges, everything from better living conditions to secret meetings with their families. Some even hinted that Harris was smuggling in contraband for inmates willing to pay. One key witness, an inmate who had been in prison for a decade, claimed that Harris had been extorting money from him in exchange for better treatment, promising a lighter sentence if he cooperated. This revelation added a sinister layer to the case. Harris had abused his position of trust and had been running a covert operation that extended beyond a simple affair. The affair with Emily Banfield was not just a personal betrayal but part of a much larger pattern of manipulation and corruption within the prison system. As detectives dug further into Emily's life, they also discovered a dark side to her relationship with Harris. It wasn't just an illicit affair, it appeared that she had been complicit in the corruption. Emily, though a dedicated wife and mother, had been receiving material benefits from Harris in exchange for her silence on the affair and his corrupt dealings. It seemed that Harris had promised Emily that her husband's sentence could be reduced if she cooperated, subtly convincing her to keep quiet about the illicit activities he was involved in. The discovery of these connections painted a far darker picture of the events leading up to the killings. Was Joseph's anger purely the result of an affair, or had he uncovered a far more intricate and dangerous reality? The more the investigation unfolded, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a violent collision of betrayal, greed, and power. The tragic deaths of Officer Harris and Emily Banfield were not the end of the story but the beginning of an even deeper investigation into the corruption that had taken root in the very walls of the prison. In the midst of all these revelations, Joseph remained silent, but his calm demeanor spoke volumes. Could he have been an unwilling participant in the larger scheme, or was his rage only a reaction to the personal betrayal? It became increasingly difficult to separate his motive from the systemic corruption that had allowed Officer Harris to abuse his power. The truth was becoming far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The trial of Joseph Lee was one of the most closely watched events to unfold in the local justice system that year. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, as the media, the public, and families of both the victims and Joseph waited for the truth to be laid bare. The air was thick with emotion, as the case had captured the attention of many due to its shocking nature and the unexpected depth of betrayal at the heart of the crime. The prosecution immediately took aim at Joseph, portraying him as a cold-blooded killer who had acted out of sheer vengeance. The evidence against him was damning. The security footage from the prison, the bloody weapon found in his possession, and his own testimony that he had attacked Officer Harris in a fit of rage. To the prosecution, it was clear, Joseph had allowed his anger and sense of betrayal to guide him to murder. They painted a picture of a man who had been consumed by jealousy and fury, unable to control his emotions, leading to the deaths of both Officer Harris and Emily Banfield. However, Joseph's defense attorney offered a different perspective. They argued that Joseph was a man broken by years of imprisonment and years of betrayal. They painted a portrait of a man trapped in a cage, both literally and metaphorically. The defense emphasized Joseph's troubled past, his time spent in prison, and the immense emotional toll the affair had taken on him. His attorney argued that Joseph wasn't thinking clearly when he murdered Harris and Emily. Instead, they claimed he was consumed by a mix of desperation, anger, and humiliation, and he snapped under the pressure of years of abuse and deceit. Throughout the trial, Joseph sat silently, his face a mask of stoic composure. But his eyes, cold, empty, as if the man sitting in the courtroom was not the same person who had once been a husband and a father, told a different story. He showed no outward signs of regret. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. There were moments during the trial when the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, as the weight of the evidence and the raw emotions of the case hung heavy in the air. The prosecution called upon several witnesses who described the corrupt activities of Officer Harris, further fueling the argument that Joseph's rage wasn't just about a personal affair, but about years of pent-up frustration with a system that allowed such abuse to fester. But despite this, the defense stuck to their claim that Joseph was a victim of circumstance, pushed too far by the man he had trusted and the woman he had loved. As the closing arguments were made, the judge warned the jury to consider all aspects of the case, not just the murders themselves but the larger web of corruption, betrayal, and manipulation that had led to those bloody deaths. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned with their verdict, the room fell silent. After what felt like an eternity of uncertainty, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. The room erupted in a mixture of reactions. Some members of the public whispered in disbelief, others in agreement. For the families of Officer Harris and Emily Banfield, the decision was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back their loved ones. There was no closure, only the grim reality that both victims were lost forever. Joseph stood motionless as the sentence was handed down. Life in prison. A sentence that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life, a man who had already spent years locked away from the world. His silence spoke volumes. The weight of the sentence, though expected, seemed to settle heavily on him. His attorney tried to argue for a reduced sentence, citing Joseph's troubled history and the psychological toll the years of imprisonment had taken on him, but the judge was firm. Joseph had taken 2 lives, and for that, he would pay the price. The case raised difficult questions not only about the actions of Joseph Lee but also about the prison system itself. The revelations of Officer Harris's corruption, his manipulation of both the inmates and the system, had shaken the community's trust in the very authorities tasked with keeping order. How could such abuse go unnoticed for so long? And how many other guards had taken advantage of their power in similar ways? Joseph's case became a symbol of the systemic failures within the prison system, failures that had allowed corruption to thrive, and at the cost of lives. Emily's family, though devastated by her death, struggled to reconcile their grief with the fact that she had been complicit in Harris's actions. Joseph's family was left to mourn the man they had once known, now a cold-blooded killer. But even in their grief, they couldn't help but wonder, had the years of emotional turmoil and the constant threat of violence inside the prison walls driven Joseph to this breaking point? Was he the product of a system that had failed him, just as much as it had failed Emily? For the prison system, Joseph Lee's trial was just another stain on a reputation already tarnished by corruption and incompetence. The case forced a hard look at how the system dealt with its inmates, their families, and the staff who were supposed to maintain order. The tragic deaths of Officer Harris and Emily Banfield had exposed cracks in the foundation of the system, and no one would leave the courtroom untouched by the consequences of those revelations. Joseph Lee would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The outcome was clear, but the questions left in its wake lingered, questions about loyalty, betrayal, justice, and a broken system that allowed such tragedy to unfold. The story didn't end with Joseph's conviction. It had merely opened the door to a much larger conversation about the dark side of prison life and the complex emotions that drive people to commit acts of unimaginable violence. This tragic tale is not just about a single inmate, Joseph Lee, or a corrupt prison guard. It's about the broader human experience, the emotional and psychological toll of betrayal, the destructive power of revenge, and the sometimes fatal consequences of dishonor. At its core, this story reflects the fragility of trust and the immense damage that can be done when that trust is broken. Joseph Lee's actions were born from anger, humiliation, and a deep sense of betrayal. But his decisions also serve as a reflection of the human struggle to deal with those emotions. Betrayal can be devastating, whether it's personal, professional, or in this case, marital. But when someone chooses to respond to that betrayal with violence, the damage extends far beyond the individuals directly involved. Lives are lost, families are shattered, and systems are called into question. At the heart of this story is the question of justice. Joseph's trial made it clear that the justice system does not always provide clear answers, especially when emotions and corruption cloud the truth. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a culmination of years of emotional buildup, compounded by a system that allowed betrayal to thrive unchecked. The prison, a place meant to enforce justice, became a breeding ground for corruption. Officer Harris used his power to exploit others, and Emily became an unwilling accomplice, complicit in the dangerous web of deceit. The case also exposes a fundamental flaw in how we view authority. The guards and officers tasked with maintaining order are supposed to be pillars of the system, but in this story, their actions showed just how easily power can be abused. Harris's corrupt behavior led to Emily's death, and ultimately, to his own. The system that was supposed to protect was compromised, and in the end, it failed everyone involved. Ultimately, this is a story that transcends the individual actions of Joseph and Harris. It's a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked anger, the complexity of betrayal, and the fragility of the systems we trust to maintain order in our lives. The events that transpired between Joseph Lee, Officer Harris, and Emily Banfield serve as a stark reminder of the dangerous effects of betrayal, revenge, and unchecked emotions. We all face moments of hurt and disappointment in our lives. We've all been betrayed in some form or another, and in those moments, we have a choice: will we let anger control us, or will we find a way to seek peace and forgiveness? Joseph's story teaches us the importance of processing emotions in healthy ways, and the consequences that can arise when we let anger and revenge dictate our actions. The pursuit of vengeance might seem justified in the heat of the moment, but the aftermath is often far more devastating than anticipated. In Joseph's case, his anger led to not only the loss of his own freedom but also the loss of 2 innocent lives. His desire to restore honor was not fulfilled by violence, but by a deep, irreversible tragedy. This story also encourages us to reflect on the systems that surround us, whether in the context of prison, marriage, or any other institution. When trust is broken or systems fail to protect, the consequences can be dire. We must ask ourselves, are the systems we rely on truly serving us, or are they, too, susceptible to corruption and betrayal? In our own lives, when we face betrayal, we must ask ourselves, are we driven by vengeance, or can we find a path toward healing and resolution? How can we choose peace over destruction, and seek justice in ways that don't perpetuate harm? Joseph's story challenges us to think about how we deal with hurt and betrayal, and whether we allow these emotions to govern our actions or whether we take control and choose a better way forward. As we wrap up this tragic tale, I want to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Joseph Lee's shoes? Would you have reacted the same way after discovering such a devastating betrayal? Do you think the punishment fit the crime, or could there have been another way to handle the situation? Was Joseph simply a victim of his circumstances, or was his reaction one that could have been avoided? This case brings up some serious questions about trust, revenge, and justice. It's one of those stories that stays with you long after the final verdict. So, I want you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have made the same decisions, or would you have tried a different approach? How do you think the prison system could have handled this situation differently? Let's discuss it. If you found this deep dive into this tragic true crime case as compelling as I did, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We'll be bringing more stories that explore the complexities of human nature, betrayal, and the consequences of the choices we make. If you don't want to miss our next gripping story, hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we post. Thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for more jaw-dropping, real-life stories that reveal the darkness hidden beneath the surface.